Welcome to Team Talk from Team Kinetic, the podcast that takes a deeper dive into volunteer management with me, Chris Martin. This week's episode of Team Talk with me, Chris Martin, is with Andy Broomhead, who is a director of the Association of Volunteer Managers, and is the second in our series of chats with guys that are involved with the Association of Volunteer Managers, and he's also the head of volunteering at Diabetes UK. It was great to chat to Andy and for him to give us a little bit of time, and it was really interesting to hear his journey to becoming a volunteer manager, because his is something of an unusual journey. I hope you enjoy this chat. It's really quite interesting, and we cover a lot of ground and have a lot of thoughts around what's really the secret ingredient, if you will, to becoming a great volunteer manager, and understanding that tricky balancing act between the needs of the volunteers and the needs of the organisation. If you have anything you want to send in to us or any feedback you want to send, then please do feel free to email me at chris@teamkinetic.co.uk. We do read every email. Please do give us a 5-star review for the podcast, as that can only do us good and get more people listening. Thanks a lot. Take care and enjoy the pod. Today I'm joined by Andy Broomhead. He's the director of the Association of Volunteer Managers, and he's the head of volunteering at Diabetes UK. Welcome to the podcast, Andy.
Thanks, Chris. Nice to be here.
You're part of our little series that we're doing with directors from the Association of Volunteer Managers, and we'll have a little bit of chat about the Association of Volunteer Managers in a little bit. But I guess as with all these, we'll start right at the beginning. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing, and how you got here today. Tell us a little bit, your backstory.
Yeah. Okay. So probably kind of coming at it from two angles, I guess. So I've had diabetes myself for 20 years. So I've had a connection to the charity that I work for a really, really long time. I started out volunteering for Diabetes UK back in 2012, and that kind of really got me the bug for that volunteering in itself, I think.
Yeah.
My professional background at the time was much more around kind of business change, and working with largely financial services companies, which is a little bit of a leap from that into charities.
Just a bit,
yeah. But working with financial services companies, but looking at a lot more around kind of business change that was supporting customer experience.
Yep.
And at the start of 2017, I was offered the opportunity to do a small 3-month piece of work for Diabetes UK, looking at customer experience predominantly through a fundraising and engagement background.
Okay.
But not needing any kind of fundraising experience to do that. It was much more about the customer journey rather than anything else.
Yeah, the process.
Yeah, absolutely. So a big organisation that was really kind of close to my heart, so I said yes. And at the time, they were recruiting for a head of volunteering.
Okay.
And I thought, well, actually, I know the organisation. Feel like there's a lot that I would be able to give to that. And decided to stop working for myself and kind of go back to being employed by somebody else. So yeah, I applied for the role in February, March time, 2017, and I started in the April, and that was that. So yeah, coming up on almost 5 years in post as head of volunteering here now.
And that is very unusual in terms of. It's not unusual for people to come from different industries into volunteering. I don't think. I think that's quite normal. But to come at the point which you did, when you were quite established in a different career, to make that jump, what was the thinking? I'm sure there's more money in financial service management than there is in volunteering.
There definitely is. I think particularly there's a lot more money being in self-employed financial services than volunteering.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of my personal philosophy, I guess, is where do I feel like I can add value to something? Where can I do something that's going to keep me interested and keep me a little bit, on my toes, but I also feel like I'm going to be able to be good at something. I'm going to be able to help somebody at the same time.
Where can you make a difference? And
exactly.
And feel good about doing it.
A lot of us probably work for charities for that exact same reason. There's that kind of like altruistic element that you can't really measure, but I think it's probably within most, if not all, people that are working in this sector.
It's a really interesting one, that point there, because it is altruistic, but there is a very important sense of satisfaction in that altruism. Does that make sense? It's not truly altruistic. You do because it makes you feel good as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's kind of deeper in the personality than just I'm doing it for the good of other people. It's a bit more, you know, I don't know. I get a bit caught up in this conversation sometimes as to
No, I
can
know
you be
exactly what
truly
you mean. I think,
altruistic? You know, it's
yeah, no, I think anything is kind of truly altruistic, is it? Nothing's
yeah,
truly selfless. But I think there is that element to it that probably drives a lot of people to
yep,
work harder, do a little bit more, feel a lot more emotionally invested in something than they would be if it was just working for a bank or any
of
old
course.
other company.
And I think it's interesting
Yeah,
as well, though, that you did come from the cause itself. You know, you like I say, you
mm,
suffered with diabetes, and you've appreciated some of the benefits that sort of afforded to you by being involved in the organisation and having that
yeah,
that sort of experience. That's I think again, you get people that end up go in within a sort of certainly the charitable sector, maybe not necessarily originally cause driven, but job driven, and then end up sort of involved in the cause. So yours is an interesting career path to come where you
yeah.
come. What skills do you reckon you've been able to bring from what you were doing into what you do now?
I think a couple of things. I think actually being a volunteer for the charity first gives you a sense of what everybody's able to achieve by being a volunteer. You're bringing your own experience of that in, but you're also seeing what other people are
Yeah.
doing and how much it affects them. And I think that's great. I think professionally, there was a lot of analytical work in what I used to do.
Hmm.
So I think, you had that ability to maybe be a little more emotionally detached from it sometimes, which I
Yep.
think is interesting in itself. Because sometimes you feel really emotionally invested in it because it's a cause you're passionate
Of
about, an
course.
organisation that you're passionate about. But you have to have that objectivity that says actually what is happening based on how we set ourselves up to do this and support volunteers and bring
Yeah.
people along with us. Actually, are we doing stuff because it's how we did it 10 years ago, and the landscape and the environment and everybody's reasons for being part of what we're doing have
Yep.
changed fundamentally? How do you how do you bring that in? And I always think it's difficult because charities aren't businesses. We're there to support huge numbers of people, but I think there's some element of that kind of business process that helps you do that in a better way.
I agree, and
Um,
I think it's a fine line between sort of that commercial mindedness and the charitable mindedness. But I
yeah,
think an awful lot of charities could probably benefit from being not necessarily more commercially minded, but more commercially savvy and more
yeah,
switched on to business thinking and process thinking, and setting themselves up with processes that would replicate what you'd see in normal business rather than
yeah,
necessarily relying on goodwill and people's willingness to go above and beyond to make things happen.
yeah, definitely. I think I think the bit that we sometimes fall on the right side of that line and sometimes the wrong side.
Yeah,
But it's how are you balancing that with the experience of people that are giving up their time for free fundamentally.
exactly that. Yeah,
You want the kind of process because as an organisation you want to feel assured that you are keeping people safe, that you're putting the mission at the very centre of what you're trying to do. But at the same time, and I probably experienced this as a volunteer, at Diabetes UK and other places as well, is that I want to engage with this, to a large degree on my terms.
of
And
course.
actually,
Yeah,
my terms and my motivations of what I want to do are really different from
yeah.
your kind of,
Your mission.
your
Yeah,
considerations that you've got to keep in mind. And
yeah.
it's being sat at the table now. It's interesting to be able to see it from both sides. Even kind of 4 or 5 years after I stopped volunteering for the charity, you still kind of go back to those bits where you were sat in that volunteer shoes and thinking, actually, this didn't make sense to me at the time, and immediately being on the other side of the table, it does make sense. But how you have those conversations and how you bring that through to people, um, yeah, is much more difficult than I think
I agree.
give
I think.
you give people credit for when you are a volunteer. You just think, just tell me it's fine. And I have
Yeah,
a lot of these conversations, and it's not quite as easy as that. But I think the essence of it is absolutely what we ought to do.
I think. I mean it's one of the things I was going to talk about a little bit later, but we can have a quick chat about because it feels it fits in now. I mean, when you look at the challenges, the organisational challenges that you face at Diabetes UK, I mean, we'll just take COVID as an example of that versus the challenges the volunteers face. What are your challenges, and how do they fit in with what you get back from the volunteers? If that makes sense, how do you sort of
Yeah,
negotiate those two?
it's interesting, wasn't it? I think for COVID particularly, from day one, the way we talked about COVID and the impact on volunteering and the charity hasn't changed, and that's always been about volunteers, health and safety and well-being. Being
Yeah.
absolutely our primary concern. We've seen all along. We're kind of coming into. We're not far off year 3 of this in some respects, are we?
Yeah, well, it's interesting as well. Your career is like half and half. You've got like
It
a
is, yeah.
half.
I've got 50% of the time was kind of normal, whatever we
Normal, yeah.
call that, and 50% of it is just kind of living in this perpetual kind of COVID stasis.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we were really clear, particularly because we knew that people with diabetes were much more likely to have poorer outcomes from COVID.
Yep.
That health, safety, and well-being was, always the top of our list. And we equally knew that for some volunteers that wasn't the case. They were much more, I just want to get out there and do stuff. I want to help. I want to make a difference. I don't want to feel like my freedom to do what I want to do as a volunteer is being
Of course.
limited.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you've got. I think it's always that slightly dull, but ultimately important legal bit that you've got. You can't get away from it.
Yeah.
And
No.
I end up having a lot of frank conversations with volunteers. Like, nobody volunteers to fill paperwork in. Nobody wants these forms. But we cannot keep you safe, and you cannot keep people safe if we don't all just kind of get on with this bit.
Of course.
And that's what it's like. I remember having a conversation 2 weeks after lockdown started, so kind of right at the end of March 2020, with one of our coordinators in England. I won't say exactly where,
No.
but they'd been to a meeting with one of our groups, and somebody had been for a COVID test that morning because they'd had symptoms.
Oh,
But they'd come out to this meeting in the evening while they were waiting,
Yeah.
and they'd had a shared buffet, and everybody was just kind of. And it's kind of, we talk about it now, and it's like, it's mind blowing to kind of think that any of us would have been in that situation. And we've all learned so much over the last 2 years. But those kinds of things, that's my responsibility. That's the charity's responsibility to
Of
keep people
course.
safe,
Yeah.
and not kind of create the environment for people to accidentally come to harm while they're trying to do something that they love. But those two things really often come up against each other.
Yeah, they
People
do.
feel that they are the best judge of what's safe for them. And it's what we've seen along, isn't it? It's vaccines, it's mask wearing. I know what's best for me, but it's not just you're making the decision for.
Exactly that.
And that's
Unfortunately, it's all
what we
been
have to do.
supercharged and culture warred up at the minute. That's the problem with it all, unfortunately. But
Exactly. Yeah.
and I can imagine that sort of plays out within your organisation at times as well.
Yeah.
But in terms of the actual sort of response then to COVID and the challenges that posed, what were the sort of biggest lessons you learned from it all?
I think what we saw as members of staff in volunteering was that we found it a lot easier to let go than we probably thought we did. So a lot of what we talked about, a lot of what we talked about, kind of over years, is how do we support more people to be a little bit more independent, do the things they want to do, and is technology some of the answer to that? And I think we always felt like yes, but we were never really sure that our volunteers, and maybe volunteering more broadly across the sector, would really take to it in a way.
I think that's definitely something we picked up, that the whole push towards digital across the board, as the people's faith in it. There's always the argument, oh, people won't do it, are a bit nervous, won't get the uptake we want. So is it worth the cost benefit analysis? Is it worth the effort doing it? And I think having it forced upon people has kind of made that case to some extent now, that every organisation's re-looking at those decisions and thinking, can we afford not to do it? Because it turns out that people, if you take your 80-20 rule, 80% of people do just crack on. We might have to support those 20, but let the 80% of people get on with it if they can do. So it's an interesting one, I think, that definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I think we saw some of our volunteers being ahead of us in terms of getting set up to organise meetings and get-togethers and stuff online. They were way ahead of the curve than we were. And, we probably had our mind's eye for a little while.
They can move that bit quicker than you can, though.
That's they can. Yeah, exactly. That kind of again, that kind of I'm coming on 2-3 weeks later with trying to slightly make them feel slightly more encumbered with a bit of process. But equally, I think we learned where to pitch that. So we saw some groups that were, really early on in that stage, having kind of interlopers into Zoom meetings, and I think we stayed away from what we normally would have done, which was try and shut it all down and control it all. We said, actually, we know that this is really important for your, physical and mental health.
Of course,
I mean, I remember going back and thinking, oh, this will be over in 3 months. and here we are, kind of
I
like,
think you mean everybody else as well.
yeah. I mean, I
I got
remember
here longer
booking
than 3
meetings in.
months. Yeah,
I
yeah.
remember booking meetings with my team saying, "Oh, we'll do these. We'll have these kind of like daily, weekly catch up things, and then we'll put them in for 3 months. That's a recurring thing in Outlook."
Yeah.
And actually, here we are. These things still run now, and it's
Yep, still sat in the kitchen on Zoom calls.
honestly, mate, nearly 3 years into it, so still sat in my kitchen.
Yeah.
But I think we were much more pragmatic about what information people needed to be able to get on and do what they do. I think, like a lot of organisations, we were scrambling around
Yeah.
to understand what our technology solution was.
Do you
How
think you will stay as pragmatic as an organisation, or do you think it starts to move back towards the?
It's an interesting question.
Yeah.
I think as with anything, those kind of old habits are sometimes hard to wean yourself off.
Yeah.
But I don't feel like it's gone back to what it would have done before. I think
Mhm.
we're coming across new challenges. I think we're coming across new ways that we need to support people, and new new risks we need to be mindful of, but new opportunities
Yeah.
we can take
Yeah.
advantage
Yeah.
of.
Of course.
We're not making it up on the fly. It's more organised than that. But you have to be much more adaptive, I think. And we talk about,
Open-minded to
yeah.
the ups and downs of these things, and it might not work the first time, might even work the second time, but by the third time, we might just about have it right. Yeah.
And I think that comes down to a lot of expectation. I think
Mhm.
a lot of people look to, not to me necessarily, but look to us because we should have the answers. And
Yeah.
we saw that through all the COVID briefings. There was this kind of expectation that we were on the inside track of what was going to get announced. We were all sat glued to the telly at 6 o'clock every evening, same as all our volunteers. Kind of what,
Frantically writing policy on the back of it.
yeah, what does this mean for us? What have we got to do? And you'd kind of get
Yeah.
an email at 8 o'clock saying, "Well, what does this announcement mean for me?" And it's like, I haven't finished
Don't
reading
know
it.
yet.
I'll tell you.
Yeah.
And I think that was interesting, that how much probably the entire sector, and certainly a lot of my colleagues in volunteering, those kind of unofficial working hours probably extended out to whatever the
Yeah, just a
number
bit.
10 briefing was at 6 o'clock,
Yep.
because we all had to kind of come in the next morning and be like, right, this is what we're saying now. And that agility and that reactivity to what was happening, I don't think any of us have lived through anything like that before. And
No,
I think we've retained a lot of that good practice. I think we
that's good.
continue to do that as much as we can. And I think it's really taught us to be more clear when we talk about expectation. So we're asking you to do this because this,
Yep.
somebody said this. This is what it means for Diabetes UK. This is what it means for you as a volunteer. Those
Yep.
lines of sight, I think, have always been really important. But I think COVID has helped sharpen some of those up quite a lot.
And now you're coming now, touch wood, allegedly, now we're coming out the other side of it for the time being. I'm not going to make any predictions, because every
No,
time I
no,
do, I'm wrong. But
won't age
now it looks like we're having moving into the summer again, nothing else. What next for you guys at Diabetes UK? What's the plan? Did you lose many volunteers, or did your engagement stay pretty consistent?
I think it's hard to say for certain. I think we saw a lot pause. I don't
Mhm.
think we had a lot of people sort of say, "Yeah, that's it. This is the natural break for me. I'm not coming back." I think
Okay,
a lot of
that's
people
interesting. Yeah.
are more in that, "I'll come back when I'm ready," and
Yep.
that's again, that's probably the second message that really formed a lot of our communication with volunteers over the last few years. Your health, safety, and well-being is paramount. Don't do anything until you feel ready to do it. And that,
Yep.
for some people that might be a few months, for some people that might be a few years, and that's okay.
Yep. Yeah.
Um, I think the future for us looks overwhelmingly like it'll be a mix of that online and face-to-face working, and I don't think
Yep.
we're going to be an exception to that by any stretch. We asked volunteers last year how they expected to be volunteering through 2022, and of the responses we got, which we think was enough for a statistically valid
Decent
sample,
stats. Yeah.
2/3 said a mix. It'll be a bit of both. And we've certainly seen that where we have volunteer support groups. So we've got around 280 volunteer support groups across the UK in some guise
Wow.
or another. And I think what they've really seen is that ability to interact and engage with more people in the diabetes because of being online. I
Yeah.
even remember, being a volunteer and doing that, 30 minutes in the city centre, a couple of hours to run a meeting, 30 minutes home.
makes such a difference to accessibility and
It
inclusion.
does. It really does. We had some groups that were, I think we had one group based in the north of England that was talking to people from Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland
Wow.
at the same time as they were talking to people, from just like 2 miles away down the road. And I think that made a big difference, particularly in the early stages. It helped give people a little bit of a sense of support when kind of doctor's appointments and checks and routine stuff that forms part of everybody's life living with diabetes got turned on its head. There was some kind of other constant there, and I think we still see that now. I was talking to one of our groups in down towards Essex at the end of last week, and trying to go and do that's an entire day out of I live in Sheffield, so kind of getting down to Essex for a couple hours in an evening is it's a
Massive
mission.
day. Yeah, it's a
But
day.
I can do a day. I can kind of sit in my kitchen for another hour and a half, and I can have what I think is hopefully I'm sure they'll be the judge of it, but hopefully a fairly good experience for everybody. And I think it improves that access to kind of people like me and some other colleagues as well. It's
I
easier
think
for
you've
us
got
to be
that
part of more things.
within diabetes as well. Yours it is such an interesting group because you've got the people with the type 1 that have been suffering from often from the sort of younger years, the teenage years when they have the onset, who need a sort of are looking for a different set of support to the type 2 that are often older and maybe come from certain communities that are looking for a different time. They want the face-to-face, they want the social sort of experience, and they are a bit more flexible in the times they can turn up versus like yourself, you at 21 who needs a bit of help understanding what's going on and what it's going to mean for you, the rest of your life.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, I think that was kind of really interesting part of the discussion we had, that I had with this group last week, that that digital engagement has brought so many benefits into people that would have been rightly skeptical. Not necessarily not rightly skeptical, but would have been skeptical of that, pre-pandemic. But having to engage in exactly. But kind of having to engage in that to stay connected to family members shows you that you can do it elsewhere. But I think what we've been really clear about and what we're hearing from our volunteers consistently is that there's a limit to how much that engagement helps, and the social capital and being in the same room as somebody else, we can't replace that. I don't think we should try to replace it either.
No, I agree.
And I think what we're seeing is we kind of, as you say, it's still 4 o'clock and it's bright outside my window, which is first time in a long time.
It's not in Manchester. It's sunny down here, so.
Wrong side of the pen, Chris.
You are definitely.
I think what we are seeing is that those groups who, took those personal choices to be slightly more cautious in their return to volunteering, as we get into lighter nights, warmer evenings, we'll start to do more. And how do we help them to come back after an extended break of being a volunteer and
build
feel
that
like
confidence back in exactly to make that step.
How do you kind of overcome that sort of nervousness and anxiety about meeting people that you've not seen for quite a while, and also balancing that with what you feel are your responsibilities as a volunteer at the same time? It's
practically, give me some examples how you think you're going to manage that, because I think that's a really interesting challenge for an awful lot of organisations at the minute. How do you the re-engagement question? We did some work with the Charity Retail Association, and that a lot of the shops are struggling to get people back in shops, as you can imagine, because it's enclosed and it's quite busy. So what's your thoughts on that sort of re-engagement piece? What are the practical bits of advice you think you might have?
So, I mean, a lot of our kind of practical stuff is kind of the practical and tedious stuff, but we've been really clear about our, kind of training that we have got in place for people that want to come back. I think, as a slightly more procedural bit, we're looking at how we make sure everybody's up to date and where we think they need to be before they start volunteering again. And, the changes that we've put in place because of COVID allow us to restate the importance of that. But we've had, pretty much all our teams across all the regions in England and across Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland as well, have had those regular volunteer social evenings. So people have been able to, as other volunteers have been at different stages of their return, they've been able to share those experiences as well.
Peer support.
Yeah, 100%. And we kind of talk about peer support mostly. We think about it for people with diabetes supporting others living with the condition, but actually it's volunteer to volunteer support. How are you learning from what that group, kind of in the next county did?
Yeah.
Are you doing something similar? Have you got a question because you're doing something that's quite different? Um, and I think just not forgetting that it is people in the middle of all this. And
Of course.
you
Yeah.
know, we were talking about people giving their time up earlier, but it's more complicated than that. When you know everybody's kind of got different, you know, family circumstances, different
Yep.
commitments, different motivations, you know, different anxieties and fears. We've got, I think, a really important responsibility to help people through those things, and I think it's probably one of the bits we don't talk about enough of as volunteer managers is how much you kind of end up in some of the details of other people's lives.
It's funny you should
Um,
say that. Me and Ruth finished last week pretty much talking about when you talk about volunteering and it's the largest sense, there's a real danger that it comes across this homogenized single thing volunteering.
yeah,
But what you've just said there is absolutely hits the nail on the head for me. That it's localized, it's people's lives, it's local friendships,
mm,
that's the bit that makes people do it, makes people want to do it, and it's really sometimes hard to try and talk about it in this other sense without losing some of that
yeah,
context of what really the job is and what really you end up doing when you're working with volunteers.
yeah,
Yeah. So
100%. It's breadth and depth. I think there's kind of you're absolutely right. You can't. We end up because it probably suits our own purposes to a large degree. I think we talk about volunteering as this kind of concept and this yeah, quite nebulous thing. But I think anybody that's spent any time working in an organisation that involves volunteers, or you know, has done some volunteer management, has talked to a volunteer anywhere, you kind of understand how personal it is for everybody.
yeah,
And I think what's quite interesting for me, I think, is that when we see that a lot with diabetes, so we kind of get that sense of diabetes is this one big nebulous thing, or it's kind of it's type one, it's type two, and you know that's it's not an unfair
yeah.
generalization to
There's
make.
elements of
But,
that,
but yeah, but there's
but it's
this
not the
kind of you know
defining
four
factor. Yeah,
yeah well there's 4.5 million people living with diabetes in this country, and I would say that there's 4.5 million different experiences of it. It
of
is
course.
you know kind of you know family circumstance, diet, socioeconomic status, all those
Hmm.
things mean that you know you could meet somebody else. I could meet somebody else that was diagnosed at 21 that's got type 1 diabetes like me, and their journey over the last 20 years will be completely different to mine. Um, and I think you know it's stepping away from volunteering for like 60 seconds, but I think that's one of the challenges we have as an organisation is that it's really difficult to tell individual stories in a
Yeah.
compelling way because there are so many of them, and what I would relate to as a person with diabetes will be completely different to what somebody else would. And I think
Building a consistent narrative is almost impossible when you've got 4 million different versions of the same
exactly it is.
story.
It's really really hard, and
Yeah.
I think that's you know probably going back to what we were talking about 5 10 minutes ago is how you overlay process onto something that is so people driven is really really difficult.
It is.
Um,
Without
but
losing that bit that's important.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that
You don't
balance
want
is
to
so
stymie
fine.
or squash the stuff that makes people passionate and motivated to be a volunteer. But at the same time, you've got to balance the risk that you hold as an organisation that's supporting volunteers.
Of
It's
course.
yeah, it's a difficult one at times.
So tell me about your journey into the AVM, the Association of Volunteer Managers. What made you
Yeah.
decide that was something you want to be involved in?
So I think quick drink. I think my my background prior to this job was one of the main drivers. I think feeling quite exposed coming in as a head of volunteering as
Yeah,
my first
makes
job in a
sense.
charity, and having had a few years' experience as a volunteer, and you know quite a lot of other professional experience. I'm not going to put myself down too much, but I sometimes struggle to see how that transferred, and I think that sense of imposter syndrome felt really real. You know, kind of 5 years ago, I'm like, I've got no idea what I'm doing here.
I'm a PE teacher that sells software. I get it every single day. Don't worry. I
I
feel where
still
you're coming
get it.
from.
I just
Uh,
I feel kind of slightly more at ease with it now. I think,
yeah.
but yeah, I think there was a sense of other people will know how to do this a lot better than I will, and where do you find that?
Yeah.
And you know, kind of Twitter for all its
Ups and
crimes,
downs.
I
Yeah.
suppose. You
Yeah.
know, there's a hugely motivated group of people that work in charities and work in volunteering that I was able to connect to, and I think through that
Yeah. I
ended
think
up.
Twitter for volunteering is
Yeah,
still probably the place to. It's still my go-to place. I think.
yeah. I mean, you kind of got to switch all the rest of it off,
I was
obviously.
just about to say the exact same. If I'm not careful, I disappear down
Yeah.
a direction I don't often want to go. But
No.
but there is a very sort of healthy volunteer manager sort of network on Twitter, which I think is
Yeah,
quite
there
useful.
is. There is, and I think as long as we, and I think we all do, but I think as long as we remind ourselves that that's not the extent of it.
Yeah.
That's true for everything in life, isn't it? Twitter is not representative of real life for a lot of us.
No, no.
Um,
Thank God.
but but I think that was the first thing. I think that was kind of what drove me into how do I find out more from people that are doing this better than I am and know more about it than I do. And I'd kind of had that benefit of Twitter from living with diabetes because that helped me connect to a lot of other people that were living with the
Yep.
condition. And so kind of that must transfer to volunteering, and it did, and it does. I think for AVM, I was actually, I think I can't remember. Must have been I went to an event a good few years back when I first started, really.
Yep.
And it's just kind of grown from there. Relationship with a really good group of people, and what I really aspired to when I started in this role 5 years ago was how do how do I move volunteering at Diabetes UK to be more of an example that people are looking towards, rather than feeling like I'm trying to catch up to everybody else's examples.
Yep.
And we've maybe done that in some instances, I think.
Yeah, maybe that's going back to your sort of corporate thinking again. You're more commercially minded. You
Yeah,
see that and you go, okay, that's what we're going to. Your sort of strategy and objective sort of mindset is probably a little bit
yeah,
different sometimes to some of the other colleagues that maybe work at the AVM.
yeah,
In
potentially. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Yeah. In terms of the AVM, what you sort of went as a resource, because there's going to be people. Well, I hope there's going to be people listening to this. There may be a person listening to this that isn't currently a member of the
Yeah.
AVM. What you tell? Quick advert here. Why should people join? What's it all about?
I think there's a huge amount of benefits. The number of events that we run on different topics throughout the year, I think alone is one of the reasons why I was so attracted to it in the first place.
Yeah,
Um, it's not just focused on charity; it's focused on anybody that's working volunteers in any sector, and that's really important because again, for me, I tend to get a little bit of tunnel vision sometimes thinking about charities, thinking about health charities in particular, and
yeah.
volunteering is so much richer than that. And that AVM supports anybody working with volunteers in any organisation. I think that's really critical. Incredible conference every year, which is done brilliantly to weather the storm of COVID and kind of sustain itself in a really practical and engaging way online over the last couple of years.
I've got to say, it's always one of my favourite
Yeah,
events because they always have such interesting speakers.
yeah, definitely. And I even kind of survived it last year when I had to kind of moderate one of the busier workshops as well. So if I can I can come through that unscathed, and yeah, it's such a good experience, and there's so much kind of networking that goes on that. There's kind of online forums and groups, kind of volunteer manager book club, all these sorts of things that you can get involved in when you want to.
Yeah,
And I think that power of community is the really important thing. And we see it through volunteering, and we see it in volunteer management that there are so many other people out there that are willing to share their experience, willing to tell you, the kind of the things that they've, you know, had success with, the pitfalls that they've had at the same time. None of us are in this to be better than anybody else. We're all in this to kind of, going back to
yeah.
that argument from earlier, but we're all in this to kind of feel like we're making a positive difference. And people are always so incredibly welcoming to do that. And that network at AVM, I think, has been, yeah, hugely valuable for me over the years.
That's I mean, it's really interesting. I think as well that being a volunteer manager, it can be a little bit of a lonely experience because often, you're working with volunteers that aren't employees,
Yeah,
so they've got their, like I say, they've got their own set of motivations, and it's a recurring theme that comes up for a lot of people I've spoken to that you can often feel a little bit isolated with an organisation as a volunteer manager because you're kind of HR, you're kind of fundraising, you're kind of this, you're kind
yeah,
of that. So I think something like the AVM offers that opportunity to talk to other people that are in a very similar boat to you and have shared experience with that same sort of
yeah,
sense of that same feeling. The other thing that's come up a few times is this idea about how we potentially professionalise the sector,
yeah.
professionalise the role of a volunteer manager, and maybe what role the AVM could play in that moving forward. I don't know, you get any thoughts about that as the director of the organisation?
I mean, I think I definitely think a lot. So a lot of things that you said, absolutely resonate with me. I think it does feel. I mean, I'm not even directly managing,
Hmm.
volunteers these days, but that sense of it can feel like quite an isolated thing because you're expected to know so much about so much.
Yeah,
even though we've got wonderful colleagues that know much more about fundraising regulation than I do, I've still got to understand it enough. I've still got to understand
of course.
safeguarding to a much greater degree than I otherwise would. I've still got to understand GDPR. I've still got to understand, kind of complaints procedure. I've still got to understand how to, be able to talk to and manage people that have got the ability to just say, no, this is not for me.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it's like everything you have to do in HR, but without
Yeah,
any of the sort of sticks to use to get people to do what you want in
yeah,
HR.
no contract with kind of supporting you in the background. And I think we would all benefit from more people understanding the breadth of skill that you need to work with volunteers and be a volunteer manager. And I think kind of professionalizing that can only really help.
Yeah,
Exactly what it looks like, I'm not going to hazard a guess at an answer just now, but I think it's probably very misunderstood as a as an occupation, as a profession. I think we talk a lot
yeah,
more about, we're trying to talk a lot more internally about how we think about community practice for our volunteer managers. How are we kind of sharing best practice? How are we talking about the skills and the competencies and the capabilities that we need to be able to do this role? Because it is so broad, it can, no 2 days are ever the same.
yeah. It can overwhelm if you're not careful.
Yeah, 100%, it can.
Yeah,
And I think I don't feel like I see that on a day-to-day basis. I don't see people being overwhelmed, but I
no,
see that
no,
that I see that kind of Monday is different to Tuesday is different to Wednesday, and you've got to be able to context switch so often.
yeah.
It's
And
there
like
needs
you
to be
say,
much more support.
knowing where to go and get the appropriate information sometimes, that again, an organisation like AVM can help you with that. Much
Yeah,
if you are dropping into safeguarding, then you're dropping into recruitment, and you're dropping it. Having that set of people that have generally one or two of them are expert in any one of those things is quite a useful resource to
100%, 100%. Yeah,
have to hand. Definitely.
yeah.
Um, Nearly there. You'd be glad to know. There's not much longer left. I guess what I'd like to finish on is what's next for the sector. What are your thoughts? There's a lot of talk at the minute around this idea around passporting. There's the work going on around the volunteer. What's it?
Vision
Oh,
for
the do
volunteering.
the uh, vision for volunteering. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, yeah, vision for volunteering stuff. So there's some big pieces of work going on, sector wide. There was the paper that came out a couple of years ago from government. What's your thoughts? What are the next? What's the next things that we need to have on our radar?
Yeah, you said we're near the end as well. I think there's a few things in there. I think there's an interesting balancing act between the amount of time that people are going to have to give in the future and the way they want to give it. It's got to be an absolute prime concern for us as volunteer managers and
Yeah,
any organisation working with volunteers. I was in a meeting this morning, quite interestingly, about if me as head of volunteering at Diabetes UK or any other organisation comes out and says, "This is what we want. This is how we want you to do it. This is where and when we want you to do it." You will be met with stone silence because we are not
yeah,
we don't have the position of power in that relationship. I think that's really interesting to remember that volunteers hold a lot more of the power in that relationship than maybe they're aware of sometimes.
yeah.
And I think maybe that we're aware of sometimes as volunteer managers. I think we sometimes
I
it's
would
quite
agree
easy
with
for
that.
us to forget that because we feel like we're involved in the kind of day to
Well,
day
you've got your
strategy
pressures.
and
You've got
planning.
to hit this. You've got to do that. You've got to do this, and
Yeah,
the assumption
it's
is these people are just out there and they'll do it for you, and that's not
one
the
of the
case.
one of the biggest misconceptions that I've kind of seen coming into working in the charity is that people that don't work with volunteers on a day to day basis think that they are available at the top of the hat.
Yeah,
And
and they cost nothing. They're
yeah,
free. You don't have to
not
invest
cost
anything in
anything,
them.
and
Yeah,
I've got a drawer full of people waiting to do something, and that's not how people's lives work. And there's a I think there's a huge amount of change coming for people that are going to need more support from organisations, from volunteers.
yeah,
I think we're already seeing people struggling to make difficult life choices as kind of cost of living goes up,
hmm,
needing more support. How are we best able to meet the needs of people that most need organisations like ours, but in a way that harnesses the skills and expertise that people who would be willing to volunteer, can give up. We are kind of, the matchmaker in the middle,
Yep,
but we are kind of coming into that with our own sort of requirements
of
around,
course, yeah.
our perception of mission, our perception of value, how we're best able to get the most from people's time where they can give it, how we, spend that money that is earned by organisations like ours in the most responsible way.
Yep.
And you don't want to get paralysed by that, but you also don't want to live in constant fear that you're not doing it as well as you could.
Yeah, again, as you started, you were not returning value. That's what it's
Yeah,
about, isn't it? Yeah.
it is. It is. Kind of if you, kind of go back to my volunteering days. If I spent 6 hours at a local fair and I've raised 500 quid, I want to feel that my 6 hours
Was
is,
worth the
my 500
6 hours.
quid
Yeah.
in the scheme of a 30 million pound organisation. Yeah, I get it's not much, but that's 6 hours of my time. And how is that? What's
Yeah.
that value like to the organisation? And I don't think we highlight, and I don't think we make that really visible very, very easily or very often. But I think the general hardest thing for us is going to be so much interconnected change that's coming up. Um, I think if you ask volunteers what they'd want us to do away with paperwork and admin and process because it feels like it gets in the way.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about nobody volunteers to do paperwork, and that is, I think, 99% true. Um, so how do we make the paperwork as low cost, as low effort,
Yeah.
as least intrusive as possible? Um,
We have an ongoing conversation in the office here about this continuum of formality to informality, and where people sit on that continuum, what people are willing to do. And although we say it's from formality to informality, really it's from informality to slightly less informal, really. And people don't want to do anything. I mean, they don't really want to read the email you send them. They don't really, when you're talking about that kind of level of stuff. So it's how can you make sure that you reduce the white noise as much as possible and send them stuff that really matters to them?
yeah,
And again, digital has a place to play in that, but it's it's difficult for organisations at organisation level when they've got certain things they want to get out to try and achieve that level of
yeah.
targeted customization to the individual volunteers. It's a real challenge, I think.
I think so. I think we kind of talked a little bit about, I kind of might be misremembering quite a lot of my degree, but I think we talked a lot about principal agent problem to some degree. Kind of we feel like we are best placed to understand the wider landscape and the place that we occupy in it, but people don't want to hear that from us. They want to hear, this is what I care about doing. This is where my passion is. I want to carry on doing that. And it's not that organizations don't value it. It's that actually our worldview, from what we see, and the people that we have conversations with, says that actually doing something completely different is going to bring the most benefit to most other people, and we have a responsibility to do that. But it doesn't mean we don't value the time and effort that we get from everybody. It's just that we've got to make difficult decisions at the end of the day.
There's only so much time you've got to
Yes.
respond to that sort of. Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
glad we got some economics in the end there, though. It
Yeah.
squeezed that right in the
I vaguely remember it after all this time. Um,
yeah.
yeah, but I mean, I think you're talking then about kind of passporting, and I think if we could solve that, that'd be huge.
It's a
So
really
many.
interesting one for me because it's almost at the minute it's a problem, a solution looking for a problem.
Yeah,
In that for the volunteer, it doesn't really do enough for them to make it worth the effort they'll have to go through to achieve it.
I
For
think
the
that's it.
organisation, it looks great, but the actual the inter-organisational issues that come with it are actually maybe too large, unless you're doing it between one or two organisations, become too large to get over.
Yeah,
So it's like, yeah, we've got the solution. We've been doing an awful lot of work around this idea of using services like Yoti and the DBS and being able to link these things and having a QR code that make it transferable. We think all this is really. We think that there might be some killer features that might help it get more adoption. Something like DBS will be a really big one.
yeah.
Right to work and things like that. If you already have to have some of this software in place on your phone for other things, but I'm just I'm not 100% convinced just yet of it's that it's going to be any use for the next couple of years. I
Yeah,
feel we're maybe 3 or 4 years before something else will happen that'll drive it on the adoption of it, and volunteering will
yeah.
then be able to piggyback on the back of that somehow.
Yeah, I don't think I disagree with that. I think what's interesting for us is we see a lot of people coming to us from a professional background where, you know, they have to have their own DVS, they've got their own
Yeah,
safeguarding requirements. You know, we see a lot of people coming from either healthcare organisations or from
of
schools
course.
in particular.
Yeah,
You know, so teachers, doctors, nurses, you know, very professional, very qualified, very intelligent people that have got all these things in
and
place.
you've
But
got to start again with them.
you've got to start again. And actually, you can see that there would be a huge amount of value in that, but I'm not quite sure it would, in its current form, it would be sophisticated enough that actually means you're not just pushing the problem somewhere else. And
Exactly
actually, you're
that.
probably
Yeah,
pushing more of the problem onto the volunteer,
yeah,
um, which probably ends up being a poorer experience. And I think, again, that's one of those things that's really, really difficult to articulate. When somebody says to you, I've already got a DVS, just use that. And you don't want to get into, yeah, but we can't for these reasons. But because it feels like a cop out. It feels like you're not really owning the problem that you've got, but actually
yeah.
you don't really have any control over it. You
No,
are,
and you get sick of that conversation, but you got to keep on having it, and it's
yeah,
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 frustrating. Yeah, no, I appreciate that.
yeah.
Is there anything else that we've not covered? Anything that on your mind around volunteering that you'd like to get off at the minute?
I think there's just kind of one thing that comes to me quite often, which is that I think sometimes being a volunteer manager is a little bit like being a celebrity, but without any of the benefits of being a celebrity. And I think
Well, I'd like to hear this. Go on.
I think a lot of it is conversations where nobody has the full information set. So I'm talking as somebody who's a volunteer manager of sorts. From my perspective, volunteers will talk to me from their perspective, and actually everybody feels like they're entitled to an opinion and everybody's opinion is equal.
Yeah, yeah.
But actually I'm not I'm not waking up and driving my Aston Martin down to Waitrose to do my shopping or anything. I'm just getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning, I'm coming to sit in my kitchen.
Yeah.
And that kind of the difficulty that we have in articulating the constraints that we operate in as as charities, as organizations
Yes.
involving volunteers, it's so nuanced and it's so complicated that you can never put that convincing picture out there.
It's
So
very
everything
hard to
that
get a
we're doing
simplistic,
is, yeah,
explanation of why you're doing what you're doing. It's because it's never
yeah,
simplistic. Yeah,
it's
that makes
not,
sense.
it's not at all. And you've kind of got 2,000 people saying, actually, I think you're wrong for this reason. And it's like, I get it.
Everybody,
And I know
everybody
exactly
loves
why
being
you
told
think
the wrong
that.
2,000 times.
Yeah. And I think there's something that, we kind of talked earlier about, how it feels quite isolating sometimes as a volunteer manager. And I think there is, because there is that real difference in perspective
Mhm.
and knowledge, across the table sometimes. And it's very difficult, as you say, people only want to hear the bare minimum that they need to know to do what they want to do.
Of course,
So
yes.
the only way you kind of get to put the kind of context and the meat on the bone is that you go around and you talk to groups of volunteers, you know, 5, 10, 15 of them at a time. And, when
Yeah.
you've got 2,000 volunteers, you're never going to get to the end of that.
No.
And 2,000 is probably on the lower scale for a lot of charities as well. So I think you can end up feeling quite isolated, feeling like you're saying the same thing. And
Yeah. Sometimes it feels like
yeah,
screaming into the void, I should imagine.
sometimes, and I'm sure,
Yeah.
kind of we all have that in whatever role we work in and whatever job we do.
Yeah.
And I think there's sometimes that sense of, how do you,
Well, you got 2,000 people that feel they own the organisation in their own
yeah,
little way,
that's it.
and you're the
And
organisation. You got to tell them that you do, but not quite as much as you think you do. And this is the reason we're doing this, because and that that in of itself is an exhausting part of the job.
yeah,
All the other bits are amazing and great. We know all them. We get the sense of it, but the bit that can tire you out is having that ongoing two-way conversation with people that
yeah,
don't really want to hear your side of it all that much.
yeah, yeah.
So yeah.
And it kind of makes me feel like I'm sort of ending on a bit of a low note there.
It's all about
I
the
really
peak
don't mean to. I
experience.
think,
No,
one of the,
I think that's a good thing to go away from for volunteer managers to have a think about. I think it's a really valid point to finish on, that there is a what's the word I'm looking for, where you have to be there is a consistency required in the sort of the nature of the person that does the job, that you have to have that about you to be able to
I think,
to do it.
you've got to be incredibly resilient to do this kind of
Resilient.
work.
That's the word I was looking for. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think, and it's kind of surprised me as a volunteer. And I kind of look back on some of my volunteering experiences, and I'm thinking, God, I must have put some people right through the ringer for, really not understanding what they were having to go through and what they were having
Yeah.
to deal with, and me asking something that felt really easy. And looking back,
telling them how they're doing the job wrong.
Yeah, that poor person, and you kind of feel like you want to go and apologise to all these people, that have left the organisation since. But you seen it, seen it from both sides as a real benefit, but actually, it's I think there's a huge amount of personal resilience that you need, and because you are dealing with people, things become quite personal quite quickly, and not like in a nasty or vindictive way, but it becomes.
Well, it matters.
Yeah, it does. It matters. It matters to everybody, and I think it's important that we never lose that in those conversations about, why have I got to do X or Y? And it's like, we're all on the same side. We're all trying to achieve the same thing. And actually,
you pulled it around quite nicely there at the end,
yeah,
Andy. You made it nice and positive to finish it there. That's it.
I would genuinely say that I've met, not just in terms of, through AVM and the number of colleagues that I've met. I would generally go back to my second week in the job was NCVO conference in London.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of just like this, schoolboy on like the first day of term, not knowing where to go. Everybody kind of knows everybody else already, and I'm just like, I don't even know what this building is. I don't live in London. I've got no idea where I'm going at all. I'm sat there, there with my little carrier bag full of stuff, and thinking about how many people I knew. Yeah, honestly, yeah. My little packed lunch and stuff, and thinking about how many people I knew in that first week working in volunteering, and think about the relationships I built across a number of organisations, with a huge number of colleagues internally and at other charities, and thinking about the number of volunteers that I've met and that richness of that experience that they've got, and the fondness that they talk about, being a volunteer with Diabetes UK. It's incredible, and I think we. And I am absolutely the same as anybody else. I think sometimes we are too quick to dwell on the little bits that we find frustrating sometimes, and that reflection of, actually, I talked to somebody the other day, and they'd had a life-changing experience by being a volunteer, and we're helping to facilitate that. It's not all down to us by any stretch, but we're part of that. And I think,
like you say, it's that balance of recognising how important it is to them, what you need as an organisation, as somehow mashing all that up that you end up all moving in roughly the same direction.
Yeah, it is. It's how do you? I think we get a lot of us get caught up in strategy and planning, and then implementation and I think we lose that human element that sits in the middle of all these things, and it's important that we do. It's important that we're not just all running off in 2 dozen directions, and I'm not really thinking about how we achieve the best for the people we're here to support. But at the same time, we shouldn't let that paralyze us. And I think it's a really, really fine line where you are able to talk succinctly about what your organisation is trying to do, how volunteers fit into that, and do that in a convincing way so that everybody feels like they own it and they're part of that. I don't think any of us have backed that particularly well. So I think that's certainly where we need to get to in amongst all this kind of societal change that we're all living through still.
Well, it sounds like you're the man for the job at Diabetes UK. You are certainly empathetic enough to recognise it. So it's been lovely to talk to you, and hopefully we'll get to actually meet up in real life in sometime in the relatively near future, and have a piece of cake and a cup of tea at an event or something.
Absolutely, volunteering, running tea and cake. So I'm
all over it. Yeah. I'm not sure. You being Diabetes UK, you'd maybe just have the cup of tea. And
no. If there's cake, I'm having cake. Mate, don't worry about that.
my diabetic mate's always got the best sweets. So
that's it. Yeah, we know exactly what we're talking about.
Well, cheers for your time, Andy. It's been really appreciated, and we'll speak to you soon. Take care.
Great. Take care.